At first glance, Kris seems like a common silent RPG protagonist, one who's simply a blank slate for us to project ourselves onto. But as we all learned at the end of Chapter 1, there's a lot more going on with this person than a simple matter of player convenience. The strangeness in the relationship between player and player character is not something that you're normally supposed to think about. Willing suspension of disbelief takes care of it, but Deltarune brings that front and center. And this acknowledgement of that is why, despite Kris's lack of on-screen dialogue or interactions, I'm more interested in Kris than any other character in the game. In Chapter 1, Kris's backstory as the mischievous kid that everyone outside their family keeps at arm's length is almost entirely irrelevant from the moment you enter the Dark World, which has new places and new faces to both you and Kris, so no one has any previously established impression of Kris. So in the Dark World, Kris effectively is a blank slate, entirely characterized by your actions, making a good self-insert character. But at the end of the game, their backstory ends up in the spotlight, with so many interactions leading to NPCs responding with how uncharacteristic it is of Kris to be doing what you're doing. Everyone just thinks it's weird that Kris can't play piano anymore, or that Kris would visit someone in the hospital without any parental influence. Anyone who had projected themselves onto Kris has had the rug pulled out from under them just when they felt they had settled into the role. Now, don't think the game is saying anything as simple as, the player can't play piano, therefore Kris can't. Of course, many of us can play piano in the real world, but the point is that we can't play the piano within the confines of this particular video game because that's what the game decided, and that's the kind of thing that separates you from Kris even beyond their backstory. You are limited by what input the game allows you. What seemed to resonate with people the most in my T-Theory video was this notion that Kris might not enjoy the affectionate choices that the player can take towards Ralsei. This has much wider implications than those pertaining to Ralsei, though. Any dialogue or action choice that you are prompted to make is your decision, as this ethereal influence of the player acting through the soul. Queen ironically states that Kris does not bother her by having things like opinions, but it's more accurate to say that Kris is unable to express them. Kris has feelings about what's going on. The clearest evidence of this is that at the end of Chapter 1, Kris gets visibly annoyed at Monster Kid for making fun of Susie. There are many instances like this where Kris's personality manages to bleed through, especially when it comes to various dialogue options, where characters will point out that Kris's response sounds, for instance, enthusiastic, confused, or mocking. So while it seems like Kris can't control what is said, they do control how it's said. Anyway, the point is that Kris has independent feelings regarding these dialogue options, and they might well be at odds with our decisions. Over the course of the game, we witness exactly one conversation that Kris has with another person outside of our influence, and that's with Ralsei of all people, under circumstances that may or may not have been orchestrated by Ralsei to get Kris alone without our oversight. By the way, this happens in both chapters. We don't know if Kris said anything or what Ralsei said to Kris, so what this actually means is anyone's guess. Whatever the case though, it's strange, and it's strange that this is a pattern now. And if Kris does have any motivations that might not align with the players, I suspect that these mystery conversations play a role in that. I got a lot of responses in the T-Theory video from people wondering if there's a way to play the game that respects Kris's self-determination. That's an interesting way to look at it, but when you think about it, by playing the game to begin with, we're already stuck in a position where we have no way to respect Kris's own will. Even if we make the same choice as Kris would, that's still taking away the act of making that choice. On the other hand, we have to consider the notion that we are part of a mutually beneficial arrangement. It does seem like we only control Kris on their own terms. Are we here because Kris allows it, or does Kris have some need for the soul? The reaction to Spamton's death seems to indicate something along those lines. From a meta angle, what really is a player character when the game is over and the player is gone? They stop being something special, not that window into the world, that one real world component of the game, not that one variable, just a character. A non-playable one, if you will. The same as the faceless masses of NPCs who, without any outside influence, all have one predetermined outcome. And I imagine that's not a fate that Kris would welcome. But let's step away from the meta stuff for a bit. A more straightforward answer is that Kris might have some physical need for the soul. Maybe Kris will die without us. Seems like all they can do is shamble around like a zombie without the player being there. Either way, it's an interdependent relationship. We need Kris to partake in events, and Kris needs us for events to happen in the way that we make them happen. But for what greater purpose is all this happening from Kris's perspective? Well, that's an easy enough question to answer. Kris goes from the creepy kid of the town to the badass hero who saves the world and has cool dark world friends. And the player gets a fun adventure out of it, so everyone wins. But is this all Kris has in mind? I don't know, but I don't think Kris would want this arrangement to end anytime soon. I think Kris is afraid of an outcome that takes the player out of the equation. Something else to note is that the soul is not purely a representation of you. It's your method of influencing the world with Kris as a proxy, that's true, but it seems clear that the soul exists beyond the player. Kris probably knew about the soul before we entered the picture. They have this entire systematic method of keeping us out of the picture by locking the soul away while going off to do who knows what in the night. What does this mean? Did someone else control Kris through the same soul in the past? Or is this not the first soul that Kris has dealt with? Did Kris know this would happen in advance and plan for it? I just don't know, but maybe we'll find out. By the way, I thought I should point out that all signs seem to point to Kris actually enjoying when you eat moss. So, if you're one of those people who wants to play the game in a way that respects Kris's wishes, have at it. So we know that Kris has their own will, separate from whatever your influence may represent, but let's think about what the intent is here. What's that clever Toby Fox fellow trying to get across? You might recall that in Undertale, the player has the unusual power of determination. This at first seems to be referring to willpower, turns out to be literal. You, as the player, are the sole being with the ability to change the outcome of the events of the game, to determine them, so to speak. I'm not here to talk about Undertale today, just pointing out that this subject of determinism is familiar territory for Toby Fox, and that's exactly what he's exploring with this character Kris here. His games take place in a universe that acknowledges the fact that it's all scripted out, with the exception of the player's influence being able to impart variable outcomes into the world. Undertale set out to take a good look at the fact that the main character cannot lose in a video game, since you can reset everything. That's what you got out of determination. What question is Deltarune asking? I'd say it's analyzing our relationship with the protagonist. The fact that Kris is their own self. Kris being independent was something that was mentioned at the end of Undertale, but it wasn't so much the focus as it appears to be with Deltarune. These games have always asked the question of, what if these characters know more than they should? We saw shades of that with Sans, and it drove him to be apathetic towards any level of destruction that he might witness until the last possible moment. This revelation would naturally be disturbing to anyone who was to discover it. The common theme of the secret bosses seems to be an awareness that they live their lives on a predetermined script, rather than by their own will. Jevil accepted this, but Spamton fought to the bitter end, giving everything he had to escape. But where could he possibly go? Kris, through our actions, is the only part of the game that is not acting out a set script. Spamton probably has some idea of this, hyperlink blocked, most likely being a reference to self-determination. As soon as he achieved what appeared to be that freedom, as soon as he made it further than anyone else, he immediately died, despite his best efforts and the efforts of the party to help him. What does that mean for someone in Kris's position? Kris responds by yelling in what seems to be an uncharacteristic fit of terror, so I think we have a good idea of how Kris feels about that. What can be done for Kris, though? Spamton seemed to have some idea, but would he have been right? He did drop a few hints that the Snowgrave path is the correct one, that it actually involves Kris attaining his hyperlink blocked. Perhaps taking this path will free Kris in some way. I'll give you my pet theory. While Undertale had choices of life or death, now your choice is between acting out the standard video game story, playing your part in the prophecy, making friends, being a hero, saving the world, all that good stuff. Snowgrave, on the other hand, simply represents not evil, but going off the rails. It's just antithetical to playing the role of the hero that you expected to play, rather than being the genocidal monster option. And that's what the secret bosses hint towards, representing some kind of failure state of ascending to something greater. I'll say maybe is the agent of sticking to the script, guiding you to stay the course and do what's expected of you. He's not malicious or evil or bad, and he probably doesn't know much about what an alternative could entail, but I reckon his job is to ensure a conventional role-playing game experience, at least within the Dark World, and maybe that's in everyone's best interest. Seems like everyone's quality of life improves if you just do what's expected of you, Kris especially. Like I said earlier, they have cool Dark World friends now, right? Who knows, maybe the cataclysm that Ralsei warns us about was just an excuse to give you some kind of motive to fix everyone's lives. But maybe that's not actually what's best for Kris. Maybe Snowgrave offers a path towards some kind of transcendence. Would the predetermined lives of any NPCs really matter when presented with such an option? Spamton certainly didn't think so. Of course, you do have to step back and ask yourself if Spamton really knows what's best. And well, there's the paradox of any escape also being the result of a predetermined outcome that we choose out of several. This might seem to be at odds with one key phrase we heard in Chapter 1, your choices don't matter. This seemed to be contradicted by the end of Chapter 1 itself, where you can either be forced out of the Dark World by an angry mob of Darkners or saved by them. So you have choices with consequences, but how much do they matter? Ultimately, the example I just gave did not really lead to a substantial difference in the game. This is the case for a lot of RPGs. You get the blue ending screen or the red ending screen, but you don't actually experience that much of a difference along the way. Deltarune isn't like most RPGs though. Now you got this crazy Snowgrave thing. We have repercussions that even extend to the light world now, with Birdley probably being dead, Noelle being completely psychologically wrecked by our jackass antics, and if Kris has feelings about all this, is probably not doing too much better. The events of the Dark World, meanwhile, barely resemble the standard path, and the strangest thing about all this is that all that's true, and the game isn't even over yet. I'd say that's stark enough of a difference to matter. So, was the game wrong when it said your choices don't matter? Is taking the Snowgrave route the one way to make it so that your choices do matter, to reject that voice? Or is whoever said that ultimately still right, since it's still not really your choice, just one that was offered to you with the outcome already decided? This is really interesting stuff that Toby Fox has done, and he really plays to the strengths of video games as a medium. I don't think this idea of characters learning their fates as characters would be very interesting if there wasn't a real human being's avatar in the equation. Think about how in any video game, your character is part of a regular old story until one fateful day they become a puppet. Then they start acting differently from how they normally might. Is Big Boss in Metal Gear an insane murderer who goes out of his way to kill people who present no threat to him? Does he only kill when needed? Does he risk his own safety to avoid killing his enemies? Well, that's not his choice to make. Does the Master Chief in Halo deliberately commit fratricide against the Marines with him for no reason? Does he risk himself to protect them? Even a question like what weapon does he favor? None of these are his choice, regardless of any prior characterization that might have been established for him. Deltarune brings this issue to the forefront, this idea of player-character division, where most games strive to make you feel nice and comfortable in the role of the protagonist. Deltarune calls it into question. Now we have to think about how weird it is that one day, years into somebody's life, they have become the agent of some unseen influence. And for the record, games that don't explore this concept aren't inferior or anything like that. Absolutely not every game needs to do this. Not every game would be better for having explored this kind of thing. And I don't look down on games simply for not asking these questions. I'd have to be pretty full of myself to think that way. It's just an interesting idea to think about, so it's cool to see a game reflect on it. So when all is said and done, the protagonist and the player are separate people, and inevitably they will be separated forever. But that raises a lot of questions in the context of Deltarune. Is Kris responsible for any of the actions they perform under our influence, whether it's killing people in Snowgrave or saving them otherwise? Does that mean Kris is nothing but a bystander in all this? Did Kris actually befriend anyone over the course of the game, or did the soul do that? How would any of these characters react if they were to learn what Kris is dealing with? The song Don't Forget might tie into this. The fantasy it refers to is usually taken as the whimsical dark world, but it could be everything surrounding the player, since they're all fiction after all. These interpretations aren't even mutually exclusive. Kris's relation to the dark world mirrors our own relation with the game in a way. Now, why does any of this matter? So they know they're in a video game or whatever. So what? Who cares about some crazy meta-commentary? Well, when you think about it, you don't really have an infinite number of choices in reality, and realistically, there are only a few ways that you're going to handle a specific conversation. Have you already made your answers before the question was asked? Could someone scan your brain and predict with perfect accuracy how you would respond to some prompt? Are we living on a script? If Spamton had escaped the confines of his status as a video game NPC, what is it exactly that changes?